Max Levchin, the engineer who built the foundation of digital payments. September 15, 2008. Lehman Brothers has just filed for bankruptcy. The global financial system is on the brink of collapse. Credit markets are frozen. Banks are failing. Panic spreads across Wall Street and around the world. In Silicon Valley, Max Levchin sits in his office at Slide, the social gaming company he founded after leaving PayPal. His phone rings constantly. Investors are pulling back. Funding is evaporating. Companies are laying off employees by the hundreds. The tech industry is preparing for another devastating crash, memories of the dot-com bust still fresh in everyone's minds. But Levchin isn't panicking. He's thinking about patterns. He's thinking about systems. He's thinking about what comes next. This is what he's trained himself to do since childhood, to see order in chaos, to find solutions when others see only problems. While most entrepreneurs are worried about survival, Levchin is already analyzing what this crisis will mean for the future of financial technology. He understands something fundamental that many others don't. Crises create opportunities for those who are prepared. They force innovation. They break down old systems and make space for new ones. This moment reveals everything about what made Max Levchin different. Not just his technical brilliance, which was considerable. Not just his entrepreneurial drive, which was relentless. But his ability to see systems and patterns that others missed. His capacity to build solutions to problems that most people didn't even know existed yet. His willingness to tackle the hardest technical challenges rather than the easiest paths to profit. Levchin's journey to this moment began decades earlier, on the other side of the world, in a very different kind of crisis. To understand how he became one of the most important figures in the history of digital payments, we need to go back to where it all started. Back to a childhood shaped by Soviet communism, by mathematical genius, by physical limitations that became psychological strengths, and by a family that valued education and perseverance above all else. Max Raphael Levchin was born on July 11, 1975, in Kiev, the capital of what was then the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The world he entered was one of paradoxes and contradictions. The Soviet Union was a superpower with nuclear weapons and space programs, but its citizens waited in lines for basic necessities. It produced world-class mathematicians and scientists, but stifled individual freedom and entrepreneurship. It promised equality but delivered bureaucracy and corruption. Kiev in 1975 was a city of about 2.5 million people, an ancient Ukrainian capital that had been absorbed into the Soviet Empire. The streets were lined with stolid Soviet-era apartment blocks, built for function rather than beauty. The economy was centrally planned, which meant shortages were common and innovation was rare. Consumer goods were scarce. Western products were nearly impossible to obtain. The Iron Curtain separated the Soviet Union from the capitalist West, and that separation was both physical and psychological. For Jewish families like the Levchins, life in the Soviet Union carried additional challenges. Anti-Semitism was a persistent undercurrent in Soviet society, sometimes subtle, sometimes overt. Jewish citizens faced discrimination in education, employment, and daily life. Quotas limited their access to universities. Their internal passports identified them as Jewish, marking them as different, as other. Many Jewish families dreamed of emigrating, of escaping to Israel or America, but the Soviet government made it difficult and dangerous to leave. Max's father was an engineer, trained in the rigorous Soviet technical education system. In the Soviet Union, engineering was one of the few fields where Jews could find relative success, where technical competence could sometimes overcome discrimination. His father worked in industrial design, applying mathematical principles to practical problems. He brought home a mindset of systematic thinking, of breaking down complex challenges into manageable components, of finding elegant solutions to difficult problems. Max's mother was a physicist, another field where Jews could excel through pure intellectual merit. She had studied at one of the Soviet Union's top technical institutes, competing in a system that was brutally meritocratic when it came to mathematics and science. Soviet physics education was world-class, producing scientists who could compete with anyone in the world despite limited resources and equipment. She brought home a different kind of thinking, more theoretical, more focused on understanding fundamental principles rather than immediate applications. Together, Max's parents created a household where intellectual achievement was expected, where mathematics was the language of conversation, where problems were meant to be solved rather than avoided. They were part of the Soviet technical intelligentsia, educated and sophisticated but politically powerless, materially comfortable by Soviet standards but aware of how much more abundant life was in the West. The Levchin household was crowded by American standards but typical for Soviet life. Multiple generations often lived together in small apartments. Privacy was limited. Resources were scarce. But books were plentiful. Education was emphasized. The family gathered around the dinner table not just to eat but to discuss ideas, to argue about mathematics and physics, to solve problems together. Max was the youngest child, born into a family that already valued intellectual achievement. His older brother had shown mathematical aptitude, setting a standard that Max would be expected to meet or exceed. In Soviet families, especially educated ones, children were pushed to achieve, to excel, to prove themselves through academic performance. There was no concept of finding yourself or exploring your interests. You studied mathematics, physics, and engineering because those were the paths to success in a system that valued technical competence above all else. From his earliest years, Max was different. He was small for his age, physically frail, often sick. He suffered from severe asthma and chronic respiratory infections, common problems in Kiev's cold, polluted environment. Soviet medicine was free but limited, focusing on basic care rather than preventive treatment or sophisticated interventions. Max spent many days confined to bed, unable to play outside like other children, wheezing and struggling to breathe. These physical limitations could have been devastating for a young boy. They isolated him from his peers. They prevented him from participating in sports and outdoor activities. They made him feel weak and vulnerable in a society that valued physical strength and collective participation. But they also gave him something else. They gave him time. Time to think. Time to read. Time to develop his mind in ways that more physically active children never did. Confined to his bed, Max discovered the world of mathematics. His parents gave him books, problem sets, puzzles. Soviet mathematical education was exceptional, producing textbooks that were rigorous and challenging. Soviet mathematicians had developed pedagogical approaches that built mathematical intuition through problem solving rather than rote memorization. Max absorbed these materials with an intensity that surprised even his academically accomplished parents. He found in mathematics something that his physical world couldn't provide, a realm where he could be powerful, where his mind could roam freely, where problems had solutions that could be discovered through pure thought. In mathematics, it didn't matter that he was small or sick or weak. What mattered was whether he could see the patterns, understand the relationships, find the elegant proof. And he could. Better than almost anyone. By age 6, Max was solving problems that challenged teenagers. By age 8, he was competing in local mathematics Olympiads, winning prizes despite being years younger than his competitors. By age 10, he had developed an intuition for mathematical structures that his teachers recognized as exceptional. He wasn't just memorizing formulas or following procedures. He was seeing deeper patterns, understanding why things worked the way they did, finding connections between seemingly unrelated concepts. His mathematical gifts brought him recognition in a society that valued such talents. The Soviet Union identified mathematically gifted children early and channeled them into specialized schools and programs. This wasn't about individual fulfillment but about serving the state, producing the scientists and engineers needed for military and industrial competition with the West. But for Max, it was an opportunity. It was a way to prove himself, to excel, to find purpose and identity beyond his physical limitations. Yet even as he excelled in mathematics, Max was aware of the limitations of his world. The Soviet Union in the early 1980s was stagnating. The economy was failing. The political system was ossified. The war in Afghanistan was bleeding the country's resources and morale. Mikhail Gorbachev would soon come to power and introduce glasnost and perestroika, policies of openness and restructuring that would ultimately lead to the Soviet Union's collapse. But in the early 80s, the future looked bleak. For Jewish families, the situation was particularly uncertain. Anti-Semitism was rising as economic conditions deteriorated. Jews were convenient scapegoats for the system's failures. The Levchin family, like many educated Jewish families, began to think seriously about emigration. They had relatives in the United States who had managed to leave in earlier waves of Jewish emigration. They heard stories about life in America, about freedom and opportunity, about a place where being Jewish wasn't a liability, where entrepreneurship was celebrated rather than suppressed. The decision to leave the Soviet Union was not made lightly. It meant abandoning everything they had built, leaving behind extended family, giving up professional positions, risking harassment and persecution during the exit process. Soviet authorities treated immigrants, especially those going to the West, as traitors. They made the process deliberately difficult and humiliating. They confiscated property. They interrogated applicants. They delayed approvals for years. But for Max's parents, the calculation was clear. Their children would have better lives in America. They would have opportunities that didn't exist in the Soviet Union. They wouldn't face discrimination for being Jewish. They could pursue their interests without ideological constraints. The risks of leaving were outweighed by the certainty that staying meant accepting permanent limitations on their children's futures. In 1987, when Max was 11 years old, the Levchin family received approval to emigrate. The Soviet Union was beginning to relax its exit restrictions under Gorbachev's reforms, and the window of opportunity was opening. They sold or gave away most of their possessions. They said goodbye to family members they might never see again. They boarded a train that would take them west, out of the Soviet Union, toward an uncertain future in a country they had never seen. The journey from Kiev to America was not direct. Like many Soviet emigrants, the Levchins first went to Vienna, then to Rome, where they lived in temporary housing while waiting for their American immigration paperwork to be processed. These were difficult months. They were stateless, neither Soviet citizens anymore nor yet Americans. They lived on aid from Jewish refugee organizations. They knew no one. They spoke limited English. They waited, uncertain and anxious, for permission to enter the United States. Finally, in 1988, the approval came. The Levchin family flew to the United States, landing in Chicago where they had relatives who could help them get started. Max was 12 years old. He spoke almost no English. He had never been to a Western country. He had grown up in a communist system where entrepreneurship didn't exist, where computers were rare and primitive, where the internet was something only scientists in military labs knew about. He was about to enter a world completely different from anything he had ever known. The transition was brutal. America in 1988 was booming. The economy was strong. Personal computers were becoming common in homes and schools. The Cold War was winding down, and American confidence was high. But for a 12-year-old immigrant who spoke no English and came from a completely different culture, America was overwhelming and alienating. The family settled in Chicago, in a neighborhood with other Russian and Ukrainian immigrants. Max's father found work as an engineer, though at a level below his qualifications in the Soviet Union. His degrees and experience didn't translate directly, and his limited English held him back. Max's mother took whatever work she could find while trying to improve her English. The family lived in a small apartment, far more cramped than what they had imagined America would be like. Max started school, and the experience was traumatic. He couldn't understand what teachers were saying. He couldn't communicate with other students. His clothes were wrong, Soviet-made and obviously foreign. His social skills were undeveloped because he had spent so much of his childhood isolated by illness. He was small, awkward, foreign, different. He was bullied. He was lonely. He was lost. But he had one advantage that transcended language and culture: mathematics. Mathematics is a universal language. The same equations work in Russian or English. The same logic applies in Kiev or Chicago. And Max's mathematical abilities were so far beyond his grade level that they became his bridge to acceptance and recognition. His teachers quickly realized they had an exceptional student. While he struggled with English and social studies, he could solve calculus problems that high school seniors couldn't handle. He competed in mathematics competitions and won, defeating native English speakers years older than him. Mathematics became his identity, his refuge, his proof that he belonged, that he had value, that he wasn't just a weird foreign kid but someone special. As his English improved over the next year, Max began to discover something else about America that fascinated him: computers. In the Soviet Union, computers had been rare, expensive, and primitive. Only government institutions and research centers had them. Personal computers didn't exist for ordinary citizens. But in America, computers were becoming commonplace. Schools had computer labs. Families were buying IBM compatibles and Apple Macintoshes. Software stores sold programs for everything from word processing to games. Max was captivated. Here was another realm, like mathematics, where problems had solutions, where systems could be understood and mastered, where his mind could roam free. He taught himself to program, starting with basic and quickly moving to more sophisticated languages. He discovered that programming combined his love of mathematics with the ability to build things, to create systems that actually worked and did useful tasks. By high school, Max was spending every available moment with computers. He joined the computer club. He took every programming class available. He started working on his own projects, building small programs and utilities. He discovered that in the world of computers and programming, his immigrant status didn't matter. His accent didn't matter. His social awkwardness didn't matter. What mattered was whether your code worked, whether you could solve problems, whether you could build things that did what they were supposed to do. He also discovered something else about himself. He loved hard problems. He loved challenges that seemed impossible. While other students gravitated toward easier projects that would guarantee good grades, Max sought out the most difficult assignments. He wanted to push himself. He wanted to prove that he could solve problems that others couldn't. This wasn't just about academic achievement. It was about proving his worth, about overcoming his physical limitations, about showing that the small, sickly immigrant kid could do exceptional things. This drive led him to cryptography. In the early 1990s, cryptography was emerging from the shadows of military and intelligence applications into the civilian world. The rise of the internet and digital communication created new needs for secure communication and data protection. Public key cryptography, invented in the 1970s, was becoming practical for civilian use. The National Security Agency was fighting to restrict civilian access to strong encryption, arguing it threatened national security. Cryptographers and civil libertarians were fighting back, arguing that privacy and security in the digital age required strong encryption. Max was fascinated by the mathematical beauty of cryptography. It combined number theory, abstract algebra, and practical computer science. It was intellectually challenging and had real-world importance. Strong cryptography could protect communications from government surveillance. It could secure financial transactions. It could enable privacy in an increasingly digital world. For someone who had grown up in a totalitarian society where the government monitored everything, the power to create unbreakable codes felt like a form of freedom. He devoured everything he could find about cryptography. He read academic papers. He studied the RSA algorithm and other public key cryptosystems. He learned about the mathematical problems that made these systems secure, problems like integer factorization and discrete logarithms that were easy to compute in one direction but nearly impossible to reverse without the secret key. He started implementing cryptographic algorithms in code, testing whether he could build systems as secure as the theory promised. By the time Max graduated from high school in 1993, he had a clear sense of direction. He wanted to study computer science at the highest level. He wanted to work on hard problems that combined mathematics and programming. He wanted to build systems that actually mattered, that solved real problems rather than just academic exercises. And he wanted to do it at a school that would challenge him, that wouldn't be satisfied with good enough, that demanded excellence. He applied to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, one of the top computer science programs in the country. The University of Illinois had a legendary reputation in computing. It was where the ELIAC series of supercomputers had been built. It was where the Mosaic web browser, the first popular graphical web browser, was being developed by Mark Andreessen and others at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications. It was a place where serious computer science research happened, where students could work on real projects with real impact. Max was accepted and began his studies in the fall of 1993. He was 17 years old, still slight and small, still carrying the accent and mannerisms of a Soviet immigrant, still more comfortable with computers than with people. But he was about to enter an environment that would transform him from a talented student into someone capable of changing the world. The University of Illinois in the mid-1990s was at the center of the Internet revolution. The World Wide Web was just becoming accessible to ordinary people. Mosaic was being used by millions. Netscape, founded by Mark Andreessen and Jim Clark, was preparing to go public in what would become one of the most famous IPOs in history. Students at Illinois could feel the excitement, the sense that something historic was happening, that the Internet was about to change everything. Max threw himself into his studies with characteristic intensity. He took the hardest classes available. He sought out professors working on cryptography and security. He started working on research projects that combined his interests in mathematics and practical systems building. He wasn't content to just learn what was in the textbooks. He wanted to push boundaries, to solve problems that hadn't been solved yet. One of his early obsessions was fraud detection. He had been thinking about security not just in terms of keeping communications private but in terms of detecting when systems were being attacked or abused. Traditional security focused on building walls and locks. But Max was interested in something different, building systems that could learn patterns of normal behavior and detect anomalies that might indicate fraud or attack. This required machine learning, statistical analysis, and large-scale data processing, areas that were still relatively new in the mid-1990s. He started building systems that analyzed patterns in data, looking for outliers and anomalies. He experimented with different algorithms and approaches. He was fascinated by the challenge of distinguishing legitimate unusual behavior from actual fraud. Any fraud detection system faced a trade-off. If you were too sensitive, you created false positives that annoyed legitimate users. If you weren't sensitive enough, you missed actual fraud. Finding the right balance required both mathematical sophistication and practical understanding of how real users behaved. This work on fraud detection would later prove crucial to PayPal's success. But at the time, Max was just exploring, driven by intellectual curiosity rather than any commercial vision. He was still thinking like a researcher, not an entrepreneur. He didn't yet understand that the hard technical problems he loved solving could be the foundation of world-changing companies. That understanding began to develop through his relationships with other students. The University of Illinois attracted brilliant, ambitious computer science students from around the world. Many of them, like Max, were immigrants or children of immigrants, driven by similar hunger to prove themselves and succeed. They formed tight-knit groups, spending late nights in computer labs, working on projects together, arguing about technical problems and the future of technology. One of Max's closest friends was a student named Scott Bannister, who would later become an early PayPal employee and angel investor. Another was Luke Nozek, who would become one of PayPal's co-founders. These friendships were built around shared intellectual interests and similar work ethics. They pushed each other to think bigger, to tackle harder problems, to believe they could build things that mattered. In 1997, Max graduated from Illinois with dual degrees in computer science and mathematics. He was 21 years old. He had published research papers on cryptography and fraud detection. He had built sophisticated software systems. He had a deep understanding of computer security and machine learning. He was ready to do something significant. But he wasn't sure what. Many of his classmates were going to work for big technology companies like Microsoft, IBM, or Oracle. These companies offered good salaries, prestigious positions, opportunities to work on important projects. But Max wasn't interested in being an employee, in working on someone else's vision, in being a small part of a large organization. The immigrant drive, the need to prove himself, the years of overcoming obstacles had given him something else, ambition to build something of his own. He decided to pursue a PhD at Stanford University, the epicenter of Silicon Valley entrepreneurship. Stanford wasn't just an academic institution. It was a breeding ground for startups. Its faculty encouraged entrepreneurship. Its students often dropped out to start companies. Google, Sun Microsystems, Silicon Graphics, and dozens of other important technology companies had emerged from Stanford. It was the place to be if you wanted to be at the center of the technology revolution. Max arrived at Stanford in the fall of 1997, just as the dot-com boom was accelerating. The Netscape IPO in 1995 had opened the floodgates of venture capital into internet companies. Entrepreneurs were starting companies at a frantic pace. Venture capitalists were throwing money at anything related to the internet. Stock prices of internet companies were soaring. The air was thick with excitement and possibility and more than a little irrationality. For Max, Stanford was a revelation. He had never been around so many ambitious, brilliant people all focused on building the future. His classmates weren't just studying computer science. They were starting companies. They were talking to venture capitalists. They were dropping out of school to pursue their ideas. The culture wasn't about academic credentials or career safety. It was about impact, about building things that changed the world, about taking risks. Max continued his research on fraud detection and security, working on systems that could identify anomalous patterns in large datasets. But he was also absorbing the entrepreneurial culture around him. He started thinking about what problems were worth solving, what opportunities existed in the rapidly growing internet economy, what systems needed to be built that didn't exist yet. One problem kept coming up in conversations with other students and entrepreneurs: online payments. In 1997 and 1998, e-commerce was growing rapidly. Amazon was selling books online. eBay was creating a marketplace for person-to-person sales. Dozens of other companies were trying to build online retail businesses. But payments were a mess. Credit cards worked for traditional retail transactions, but they were clunky for internet payments. The fees were high, typically 2 to 3% plus fixed transaction fees. The fraud rates were terrible because online merchants couldn't verify that the person using the credit card was actually the cardholder. Small transactions were uneconomical because of the fixed fees. Person-to-person payments were nearly impossible because credit card networks weren't designed for that use case. The existing payment infrastructure was built for a world of physical retail transactions. It assumed merchants had physical locations, that cards would be swiped in person, that there was inherent trust in face-to-face commerce. None of these assumptions held for internet transactions. People were buying from merchants they had never heard of, in cities they had never visited, with no way to know if they would actually receive what they ordered. Merchants were accepting payments from people they couldn't verify, with no way to know if the credit card was stolen or if the transaction would be reversed. Some companies were trying to solve parts of this problem. Cybercash was attempting to build secure payment systems for online retail. First Virtual was trying to create email-based payment systems. Various companies were experimenting with digital cash and electronic money. But none of them had gained significant traction. The systems were too complicated, too expensive, or required too much change from existing behaviors. Max saw this problem differently than most people did. While others focused on building better interfaces or payment instruments, he saw it as fundamentally a security and fraud problem. The reason credit cards didn't work well online wasn't just about user experience. It was about the explosion of fraud that came with not being able to verify the physical card or the identity of the cardholder. Any successful online payment system would have to solve fraud detection, or it would be destroyed by losses. This realization connected everything Max had been working on for years. His cryptography knowledge could help secure communications and protect sensitive data. His fraud detection systems could identify suspicious transactions in real time. His systems building experience could create infrastructure that scaled to millions of transactions. He had, almost accidentally, developed exactly the skill set needed to build a secure online payment system. In late 1998, Max met Peter Thiel. Thiel was 29 years old, a former securities lawyer and derivatives trader at Credit Suisse. He had started a hedge fund called Thiel Capital Management but was growing restless with traditional finance. He was interested in technology, in the internet, in opportunities to build something big. He was brilliant, contrarian, and ambitious. He had philosophical interests that went beyond just making money. He thought about first principles, about what the world needed, about how technology could reshape society. Thiel had an idea for a company that would create digital currency for PDAs, the personal digital assistants that people like him carried around. His vision was that people would beam money to each other using the infrared ports on their Palm Pilots. It would be convenient, instant, person-to-person digital payments without going through banks or credit card companies. He called it Confinity, short for infinite confidence. Max thought the PDA idea was terrible. PDAs were niche devices. The beaming interface was awkward. The use case was unclear. Who would go through the trouble of setting up digital wallets on their Palm Pilots just to occasionally split a dinner bill? But Max saw something in Thiel, and Thiel saw something in Maximum. Thiel had vision and business experience but limited technical depth. Max had deep technical expertise but limited business experience. They complemented each other. More importantly, they shared a worldview. Both were immigrants or children of immigrants. Thiel's family had come from Germany. Both had been shaped by experiences of displacement and the drive to prove themselves. Both were intellectually ambitious, interested in big ideas, willing to tackle hard problems. Both were contrarians who questioned conventional wisdom. Both believed that building something important was worth more than playing it safe. They started working together, iterating on the idea. Max pushed Thiel to think beyond PDAs. The internet was where the action was. Email was universal in a way PDAs weren't. What if they built a system that let people send money as easily as sending an email? What if they solved the fraud problem that made online payments so risky? What if they created a payment platform that worked for both retail transactions and person-to-person payments? In December 1998, they founded Confinity with funding from some of Thiel's former colleagues and friends. The founding team included Max as Chief Technology Officer, Peter Thiel as Chief Executive Officer, Luke Nosek, who Max had known from Illinois, and Ken Howery. They set up shop in an office on University Avenue in Palo Alto, the heart of Silicon Valley startup land. Max was 23 years old and Chief Technology Officer of a company that aimed to revolutionize how money moved on the internet. The challenges they faced were enormous. They were competing against huge established companies like Visa and MasterCard. They were trying to solve technical problems that had stumped dozens of previous startups. They were entering a regulated industry where one mistake could bring down federal prosecutors. They had almost no money, especially after the market crash that would come in 2000. They had no users, no reputation, no track record. But they had something most competitors lacked: Max's technical brilliance applied to the right problem at the right time. Over the next few years, he would build systems that solved fraud detection at unprecedented scale, that made online payments fast and secure, that processed billions of dollars in transactions. He would make technical decisions that enabled PayPal to survive and thrive while dozens of competitors failed. He would create innovations in machine learning and fraud detection that became industry standards. The journey from Confinity to PayPal and eventually to eBay would be filled with near-death experiences, fierce battles with competitors and regulators, internal conflicts over strategy and control, and brilliant technical innovations that solved problems everyone said were impossible. Max would grow from a gifted engineer into a leader, learning how to build teams, make strategic decisions, and navigate the complex world of venture capital and corporate politics. But all of that was still ahead. In late 1998, Max Levchin was just getting started. The Soviet immigrant who had been sickly and small, who had struggled with English and American culture, who had found refuge in mathematics and computers, was about to help build one of the most important financial technology companies in history. His journey from Kiev to Silicon Valley, from Soviet oppression to American opportunity, from mathematical prodigy to technology entrepreneur, was about to enter its most important phase. The secret sources of Max Levchin's success, the advantages that would let him accomplish what others couldn't, were already in place even before Confinity was founded. Understanding these sources is crucial to understanding why Max succeeded where so many others failed, why PayPal survived when hundreds of other payment startups died, why the systems he built worked when conventional wisdom said they couldn't. Max's informational advantage came primarily from his unusual background and focus. Most people working on internet payments in the late 1990s came from finance or business backgrounds. They understood transaction flows and business models but had limited technical depth. Or they came from web development backgrounds, skilled at building interfaces but weak on security and fraud prevention. Max came from a completely different direction: deep mathematics, cryptography, and statistical machine learning. This combination was rare and powerful. Cryptography gave him expertise in securing communications and protecting sensitive data, essential for any payment system that would handle credit card numbers and personal information. His fraud detection research gave him frameworks for identifying anomalous patterns in large datasets, critical for catching fraudulent transactions before they caused losses. His systems building experience gave him the ability to architect infrastructure that could handle scale, reliability, and performance requirements that would have overwhelmed most engineers. More subtly, his Soviet background gave him a different mental model for thinking about adversarial systems. In the West, most engineers built systems assuming users would behave reasonably. They worried about bugs and errors but not deliberately malicious actors. Max had grown up in a society where everyone assumed the system was rigged, where cheating was normal, where you had to be paranoid to survive. This made him instinctively think about how systems could be attacked, how users would try to game them, how criminals would exploit weaknesses. This paranoid mindset was perfect for fraud detection. While other engineers built payment systems that were technically sophisticated but naively trusted users, Max built systems that assumed everyone was trying to cheat. He anticipated attack vectors that others didn't see. He built defenses against fraud techniques that didn't exist yet but that he could imagine criminals developing. This proactive paranoia gave PayPal a massive advantage against fraudsters who overwhelmed less sophisticated competitors. Max's relationship advantage came from an unusual source for someone who had been socially awkward as a child. He had built deep connections with other highly talented engineers and entrepreneurs, primarily through his time at Illinois and Stanford. These weren't casual friendships. They were bonds forged through late nights working on hard problems together, through shared immigrant experiences and ambitions, through mutual respect for each other's abilities. Luke Nosek, who became one of PayPal's co-founders, was someone Max had known from Illinois. They had worked on projects together. They trusted each other's judgment. When Max was building Confinity's early team, he could recruit people like Nosek not through salary offers but through personal relationships and shared vision. This gave Confinity access to talent it couldn't have afforded to hire through normal channels. Peter Thiel was a different kind of relationship. Thiel brought business sophistication, strategic thinking, and access to capital that Max lacked. But the relationship worked because they had complementary blind spots. Thiel needed someone who could actually build the technology. Max needed someone who could navigate the business and fundraising side. They challenged each other. Thiel pushed Max to think about business model and strategy, not just elegant technical solutions. Max pushed Thiel to understand technical constraints and possibilities, not just blue sky vision. This partnership became one of the defining relationships of both their careers. Later successes for both men, Max with Slide and Affirm, Thiel with Facebook and Palantir, were enabled by networks and reputations built through their work together on PayPal. The PayPal Mafia, as the extended network of PayPal alumni came to be called, became one of the most successful entrepreneurial networks in Silicon Valley history. Max was a central node in that network. Max's process advantage was his systematic approach to fraud detection. This deserves detailed attention because it was the technical innovation that made PayPal viable when competitors failed. Online fraud in the late 1990s and early 2000s was an existential threat to any payment company. Criminals had figured out that online transactions were easy to exploit. They would steal credit card numbers, create accounts with fake information, make fraudulent purchases, and disappear before the fraud was detected. Traditional fraud detection relied on rules. If a transaction was over a certain amount, flag it. If the billing address didn't match the shipping address, flag it. If purchases came from certain countries, flag it. These rule-based systems were brittle. Criminals learned the rules and worked around them. The systems generated massive numbers of false positives, legitimate transactions that got flagged and blocked, annoying customers and reducing sales. Max approached fraud detection differently, using machine learning and statistical analysis to build systems that learn patterns rather than following rigid rules. The core insight was that fraudulent transactions have statistical signatures that distinguish them from legitimate transactions, but these signatures are subtle and constantly evolving. A machine learning system could analyze millions of transactions, identify the patterns associated with fraud, and continuously update its models as criminal tactics changed. Building such a system required solving several hard technical problems. First, you needed massive amounts of data. Machine learning systems improve with more training data, but early-stage startups don't have millions of transactions to learn from. Max solved this through clever bootstrapping, using limited early data to build initial models, then rapidly iterating as more data became available. He also used techniques like anomaly detection that could work with smaller datasets by identifying outliers rather than learning complex patterns. Second, you needed features that captured meaningful signals about fraud risk. A feature is a measurable characteristic of a transaction that might correlate with fraud. Some features were obvious: transaction amount, time of day, country of origin. But Max developed hundreds of features that captured subtle patterns. How quickly did the user fill out the form? Did they copy-paste information or type it? What was the ratio of their bid to the average price for that item on eBay? How many accounts had been created from that IP address? Third, you needed real-time processing. It wasn't good enough to detect fraud hours or days later. By then the money was gone. You needed to evaluate transactions in milliseconds and decide whether to approve, decline, or flag for manual review. This required building infrastructure that could handle enormous computational load, making thousands of predictions per second with strict latency requirements. Fourth, you needed to handle the adversarial nature of the problem. Unlike most machine learning applications where the data distribution is stable, fraud detection is an arms race. Criminals adapt to your defenses. If your system learns to detect a particular fraud pattern, criminals try new patterns. Your system needs to continuously learn, adapting to new attack vectors faster than criminals can develop them. Max built systems that addressed all these challenges. PayPal's fraud detection became legendary in the industry. While competitors like BillPoint and Yahoo Payments were hemorrhaging money to fraud, sometimes losing more to fraud than they made in revenue, PayPal kept fraud rates below 1%. This wasn't just about saving money on fraud losses. It was about survival. Visa and MasterCard set threshold fraud rates that merchants had to stay below or face termination. Payment processors that couldn't control fraud lost their ability to process credit cards. PayPal succeeded where others failed largely because Max's fraud systems worked. The technical innovations Max developed at PayPal became industry standards. The idea of using machine learning for real-time fraud detection, now commonplace in financial technology, was pioneering at the time. The specific techniques Max developed, like velocity checking that looked at patterns across time, device fingerprinting that identified suspicious devices, and graph analysis that identified rings of connected fraudulent accounts, were adopted by competitors and became best practices. Max's cultural advantage came from creating a team environment that attracted and retained exceptional engineers. Early PayPal was a brutal place to work in many ways. The hours were insane, often 100-hour weeks during crises. The pressure was intense, with the company perpetually close to running out of money or being shut down by regulators. The office environment was Spartan, with cheap furniture and limited amenities. But for the right kind of person, it was exhilarating. Max created a culture where hard problems were celebrated, where elegance and cleverness were valued, where engineers had autonomy to solve problems their way. There was no bureaucracy, No political posturing, no meaningless meetings. You were judged purely on whether you could solve the problems in front of you. If you could contribute, you were valued. If you couldn't, you were gone. This culture attracted a particular type of engineer. People who were brilliant but socially awkward found a home. People who cared more about technical excellence than career advancement thrived. Immigrants and outsiders who didn't fit traditional corporate cultures felt comfortable. Many of PayPal's early engineers were, like Max, immigrants or children of immigrants, driven by similar hungers to prove themselves. Max also created a culture of what he called militant pragmatism. Engineers were expected to be brilliant but also to ship working code. Elegant solutions that never launched were worthless. Pragmatic solutions that solved customer problems were valuable. This balance between intellectual rigor and practical results became a hallmark of companies Max was involved with. The PayPal engineering team became a training ground for future leaders of Silicon Valley. Engineers who worked for Max went on to found or lead major companies. Jeremy Stoppelman and Russell Simmons founded Yelp. Jawed Karim, Steve Chen, and Chad Hurley founded YouTube. Reid Hoffman led LinkedIn. David Sachs led Yammer. This talent density wasn't accidental. It was the result of Max's ability to identify exceptional people, give them hard problems, and create an environment where they could grow. Max's structural advantage came from PayPal's unusual business model and timing. Most payment companies tried to make money from transaction fees, charging merchants for processing payments. This put them in direct competition with established credit card networks and processors who had existing relationships and economics. PayPal started differently, focusing on person-to-person payments where no established players existed. The decision to focus on eBay, which happened somewhat accidentally, gave PayPal a structural advantage that other payment companies lacked. eBay was a rapidly growing marketplace where buyers and sellers needed to exchange payments but had no established way to do so. Sellers wanted their money quickly and cheaply. Buyers wanted protection against fraud. The existing options, like mailing checks or money orders, were slow and risky. PayPal offered instant, convenient, relatively secure payments that solved real problems for both buyers and sellers. This created network effects that became self-reinforcing. As more eBay sellers accepted PayPal, more buyers signed up to use it. As more buyers had PayPal accounts, more sellers wanted to accept it. The growth was viral in a way that traditional payment services weren't. Each transaction involved two people who both needed PayPal accounts, naturally spreading the service through the eBay community. Max understood these network effects and built systems to accelerate them. PayPal's early growth was driven partly by a controversial but effective referral program that paid people to sign up and invite friends. This was expensive in the short term but created the critical mass needed for network effects to take over. Once PayPal reached a tipping point on eBay, becoming the dominant payment method, it was very difficult for competitors to dislodge them. The timing was also crucial. PayPal launched just as eBay was experiencing explosive growth but before eBay fully understood the strategic importance of payments. If they had waited another year or two, eBay might have built its own payment system or acquired a competitor before PayPal could establish its position. If they had launched earlier, eBay might not have been large enough to provide the user base needed for network effects. The timing, partly lucky but also partly the result of Max and Peter's ability to see the opportunity, was perfect. Max's meta pattern, the overarching approach that unified all these advantages, was his ability to identify hard technical problems that mattered commercially and then solve them systematically. Many engineers love hard problems but work on things with no market value. Many business people identify important market opportunities but can't solve the technical challenges. Max combined both, the ability to see what needed to be built and the technical depth to actually build it. This combination manifested throughout his career. At Slide, he built a social gaming platform at massive scale, solving difficult infrastructure and scaling problems. At Affirm, he tackled the challenge of real-time consumer credit underwriting, using machine learning to assess risk in milliseconds. In each case, he found areas where hard technical problems created barriers to entry that protected his companies from competition. Solutions that looked obvious in retrospect required breakthrough technical work that most competitors couldn't replicate. Understanding these secret sources of Max's success helps explain not just why PayPal succeeded but why Max's subsequent ventures also achieved significant success. These weren't lucky flukes. They were the result of systematic advantages that Max built over his lifetime, advantages that started with a sickly child in Soviet Kiev teaching himself mathematics and compounded through decades of focused work on hard problems. The early days of Confinity were chaotic and exhilarating. Max and the founding team worked out of a small office on University Avenue in Palo Alto, surrounded by other startups all chasing their own visions of internet glory. It was late 1998 and early 1999, the height of the dot-com boom. Money flowed freely from venture capitalists to anyone with an internet idea. Stock prices of internet companies soared regardless of revenue or profits. The prevailing wisdom was that the internet changed everything, that old business rules no longer applied, that the key was to grow as fast as possible and figure out profitability later. In this environment, Confinity's original plan to enable payments between Palm Pilots looked quaint and limited. The team quickly realized they needed to pivot to something bigger. The insight came from watching how people were actually trying to use their product. Early users didn't want to beam money to each other in person. They wanted to send money to people who weren't physically present. They wanted to pay for things they bought online. They wanted something that worked through the internet, not through infrared ports. Max and Peter made the crucial decision to rebuild Confinity as an email-based payment system. You would send money by entering the recipient's email address and the amount. They would receive an email notification that money was waiting for them. If they didn't have a PayPal account yet, they would create one to claim the money. It was simple, elegant, and required no specialized hardware. Anyone with an email address could use it. But making this vision work required solving enormous technical challenges. Max had to build systems that could securely store credit card information and bank account details. He had to integrate with the existing financial infrastructure of banks and credit card networks, systems that were decades old and designed for very different use cases. He had to handle the complex regulations around money transmission, which varied by state and required licenses and compliance procedures. And most critically, he had to solve fraud. Fraud was the problem that killed most of Confinity's early competitors. Criminals had discovered that online payment systems were easy targets. They would steal credit card numbers from various sources, create accounts using fake information, send money to themselves through the payment system, and withdraw it before anyone noticed. By the time the credit card companies reversed the fraudulent charges, the criminals and the money were long gone. The payment company was left holding the losses. Traditional payment processors dealt with fraud by being very conservative. They required extensive verification of identity. They manually reviewed suspicious transactions. They held funds for long periods to ensure charges weren't reversed. But these approaches didn't work for PayPal's model. Extensive verification would destroy the user experience. Manual review didn't scale to thousands of transactions per day. Holding funds would make the service useless for people who needed their money quickly. Max had to build something entirely new. He started with the fraud detection research he had done at Illinois and Stanford, but had to adapt it to the specific challenges of online payments. He built systems that collected hundreds of data points about each transaction and user. Every click, every keystroke, every bit of information about the user's device and behavior was captured and analyzed. Machine learning algorithms looked for patterns associated with fraud, patterns that were often invisible to human reviewers. The system worked but required constant iteration. Fraudsters would probe for weaknesses, trying different attack patterns to see what worked. When they found a vulnerability, they would exploit it heavily before Max's team could deploy a fix. This led to a pattern that would define PayPal's early years: intense periods of crisis when fraud spiked, followed by frantic all-night coding sessions to patch the holes, followed by brief periods of stability before the next attack wave. One particularly brutal episode came in early 2000 when PayPal's fraud rate suddenly exploded. Criminals had figured out that PayPal's systems were less sophisticated at detecting fraud on weekends when fewer engineers were monitoring the systems. They would launch massive fraud attacks on Friday nights, stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars before anyone noticed on Monday morning. Max and his team started taking turns sleeping at the office on weekends, ready to respond to fraud attacks at any hour. The stress was immense. The company was losing money on every transaction due to fraud costs. Venture capitalists were getting nervous. Some on the board wanted to shut down the service and pivot to something else. But Max believed he could solve the problem if given time and resources. He convinced the team to invest heavily in fraud detection infrastructure, even as the company was burning through cash at an alarming rate. The breakthrough came when Max developed what he called a velocity system. Instead of just looking at individual transactions in isolation, the system tracked patterns over time. How many transactions was an account doing per hour? How many accounts were being created from the same IP address? How many payments were going to the same recipient from different accounts? By analyzing these velocity metrics, Max's system could detect coordinated fraud attacks that looked legitimate when examined transaction by transaction. This innovation, combined with continuous improvements to the machine learning models, gradually brought fraud under control. By mid-2000, PayPal's fraud rates had fallen from peaks above 10% of transaction volume to below 2%. This was still higher than Max wanted, but it was survivable. More importantly, it was far better than any competitor was achieving. Companies like BillPoint, eBay's own payment service, were hemorrhaging money to fraud. PayPal's fraud systems became a major competitive advantage. But even as the fraud problem came under control, new crises emerged. The dot-com bubble was beginning to burst. In March 2000, the Nasdaq peaked and began a collapse that would wipe out trillions of dollars in market value. Companies that had been worth billions were suddenly worth nothing. Venture capital dried up. Startups that couldn't achieve profitability quickly were failing by the hundreds. PayPal was burning millions of dollars per month, primarily on customer acquisition costs. The company was paying $20 for every new customer it acquired through its referral program, hoping that network effects would eventually make each customer profitable. But with the market crashing and funding difficult to obtain, this strategy looked increasingly unsustainable. The company needed to either raise more money, find a path to profitability, or shut down. Max and Peter made a series of hard decisions that would determine PayPal's fate. First, they slashed the customer acquisition bonuses, reducing costs dramatically but risking a slowdown in growth. Second, they focused intensely on eBay, where PayPal was already gaining traction. If they could become the dominant payment method on eBay, the network effects would drive organic growth without expensive marketing. Third, they cut costs everywhere else, laying off employees, moving to a cheaper office, eliminating any spending that wasn't absolutely essential. These decisions were painful but effective. By late 2000, PayPal's growth on eBay was accelerating. More than half of eBay sellers were accepting PayPal. More than a quarter of eBay transactions involved PayPal. The viral growth on eBay meant PayPal could acquire new customers cheaply through organic adoption rather than expensive marketing. The company was still losing money, but a path to profitability was becoming visible. Then came the war with eBay. Pierre Omidyar, eBay's founder, and Meg Whitman, its CEO, had been watching PayPal's growth with increasing alarm. Payments were strategically important to eBay's business model. The company made money from listing fees and commissions on sales, but if buyers and sellers couldn't easily exchange payment, the marketplace didn't work. eBay had tried to solve this themselves with BillPoint, but BillPoint was losing to PayPal badly. In late 2000, eBay made two moves to protect its interests. First, they promoted BillPoint aggressively on the eBay site, giving it prominent placement and features that PayPal didn't get. Second, they announced they were considering buying PayPal's main competitor, an online payment company called X.com that had been founded by Elon Musk and was pursuing a similar strategy of targeting eBay users. The X.com situation was complicated and ultimately led to one of the most important mergers in Silicon Valley history. Elon Musk had started X.com as an online bank and payment system, funded with money he had made from selling Zip2, his first startup. X.com and PayPal were competing fiercely for eBay users, spending enormous amounts on customer acquisition and fighting each other for market share. Both companies were burning cash at unsustainable rates. Both were struggling to raise additional funding in the deteriorating market environment. Both faced threats from eBay's increasingly aggressive promotion of BillPoint. In early 2000, the two companies began merger discussions. After intense negotiations, they agreed to combine, with the merged company keeping the X.com name but eventually rebranding to PayPal because that brand had more recognition and value. The merger was messy. Elon Musk became CEO of the combined company, but tensions quickly emerged between the X.com and PayPal cultures. Musk wanted to rebuild the technology platform using different tools and approaches. Max and the PayPal engineering team resisted, arguing that the existing system worked and that a rewrite would be dangerous and distracting. Strategy disagreements emerged about which products to prioritize and how to compete with eBay. The conflicts came to a head in September 2000 when the board, urged by Peter Thiel and Max Levchin among others, replaced Musk as CEO with Peter Thiel. This was traumatic for everyone involved. Musk felt betrayed. Some of the X.com employees left in protest. But the board believed the company needed focused leadership during a critical period, and Thiel's vision aligned better with what was working in the market. Under Thiel's leadership with Max driving the technical strategy, PayPal focused relentlessly on winning eBay. The company improved the user experience for eBay sellers and buyers. Max's team built tools that made it easier for sellers to integrate PayPal into their listings. They added features like shipping label printing that gave sellers reasons to choose PayPal beyond just payments. They worked to make PayPal so much better than BillPoint that eBay users would demand it despite eBay's efforts to promote its own service. The strategy worked. By 2001, PayPal was processing the majority of eBay's payment volume. Sellers preferred PayPal because it was easier to use and had better features. Buyers preferred PayPal because more sellers accepted it and because they trusted it more than BillPoint, which felt like eBay forcing them to use an inferior service. The network effects had reached a tipping point. PayPal's position on eBay was becoming unassailable. But just as PayPal was winning on eBay, new threats emerged from regulators. State banking regulators and the federal government were examining whether PayPal was operating as an unlicensed bank or money transmitter. Money transmission was heavily regulated, requiring licenses in each state and compliance with numerous rules around capital requirements, reporting, and consumer protection. PayPal had obtained some licenses but not all, arguing that it was a payment processor rather than a money transmitter. This wasn't just a technical legal question. If regulators decided PayPal needed full money transmission licenses in all states, the cost and time required to obtain them could cripple the company. Worse, regulators could shut down PayPal's operations while the licensing was pending. This threat was existential. Without the ability to process payments, PayPal had no business. Max wasn't directly involved in the regulatory battles, but he understood their importance. The company hired lawyers, lobbied regulators, and began the expensive process of obtaining the necessary licenses. The regulatory uncertainty made fundraising more difficult and created constant anxiety. At any moment, a regulator could shut them down. The company operated under this threat for years, gradually working through the licensing requirements state by state. Another challenge was the cost structure. PayPal had grown rapidly but was still losing money on most transactions. The company charged merchants a fee for receiving payments, typically around 2.5% of the transaction amount plus 30 cents per transaction. But PayPal's costs were higher. They had to pay interchange fees to credit card companies. They had fraud losses. They had chargeback costs when transactions were disputed. They had operational costs for customer service and technology infrastructure. Achieving profitability required optimizing every part of the system. Max's team worked to reduce fraud, which directly improved margins by reducing losses. They negotiated better rates with credit card companies. They built more efficient infrastructure that could process transactions at lower cost. They implemented fees on certain types of transactions that had been free. Slowly, transaction by transaction, they moved toward profitability. In February 2002, PayPal went public. The IPO was not an unqualified success by dot-com boom standards. The market was still depressed from the crash, but it was a milestone. The company raised money that would give it runway to achieve profitability. It gained credibility that helped with regulators and partners. And it made Max and many other early employees wealthy, though not yet spectacularly so given the modest valuation. The IPO also started a clock. As a public company, PayPal faced quarterly earnings pressure. The company needed to show a path to profitability soon or the stock would collapse. Max and the team intensified their efforts to reduce costs and improve margins. By the second half of 2002, PayPal was approaching break-even. The company had survived the dot-com crash, the fraud crises, the regulatory threats, and the war with eBay. It was going to make it. Then eBay made an offer to buy PayPal. After years of trying to compete with PayPal and failing, eBay decided that if you can't beat them, buy them. In July 2002, eBay announced it would acquire PayPal for $1.5 billion. For Max, Peter, and other founders and early employees, this represented a massive financial outcome. Max's stake was worth tens of millions of dollars. The sickly immigrant kid who had arrived in America knowing no English was now wealthy beyond anything his family could have imagined. But the sale also represented the end of an era. PayPal would no longer be an independent company. It would become part of eBay's corporate structure. The culture that Max had built, the scrappy intensity and technical excellence, would inevitably change as PayPal integrated with a much larger company. Many of the early employees would leave, going on to found or join other startups. The PayPal mafia was about to spread across Silicon Valley. For Max personally, the eBay acquisition was bittersweet. He was proud of what PayPal had accomplished. The company had revolutionized online payments. It had solved problems that everyone said were impossible. It had created real value for millions of users. And it had made Max and his colleagues wealthy. But Max was only 27 years old. He wasn't ready to settle into a comfortable corporate role. He wanted to build something new, to tackle new hard problems, to prove himself again. Max stayed at eBay for a while after the acquisition, helping with the integration and transition. But his heart wasn't in it. Working for a large corporation, dealing with corporate politics and bureaucracy, wasn't what motivated him. He missed the intensity and focus of a startup, the ability to make decisions quickly and execute without endless meetings and approvals. By 2004, Max was ready to move on. The lessons Max learned at PayPal would shape everything he did afterward. He had learned how to build and lead world-class engineering teams. He had learned how hard problems could become competitive moats that protected companies from competition. He had learned that technical excellence alone wasn't enough, that you also needed to understand business models, markets, and timing. He had learned how to operate under intense pressure, making critical decisions quickly with incomplete information. And he had learned that the most important thing was picking the right problem to solve. These lessons would inform his next major venture, a company called Slide that aimed to build a platform for social applications and games. Slide would become one of the largest social gaming companies before social gaming became a defined category. It would be acquired by Google for nearly $200 million. But it would also teach Max some painful lessons about building consumer products, about the fickleness of consumer preferences, and about the challenges of competing with much larger platform companies. The Slide story began in 2004 when Max was thinking about what to do next after leaving eBay. He was looking for a new hard problem to solve, something that would be technically challenging but also commercially important. He was watching the early growth of social networking sites like Friendster and MySpace and thinking about what infrastructure these platforms would need as they scaled. One problem that interested him was how to share photos and media online in ways that felt native to social networks rather than just uploading files to a server. The existing options were clunky. You uploaded photos to a service, got a link, and sent the link to friends. Max envisioned something more integrated, where media could be shared and viewed within social networks themselves, where the sharing experience felt like part of the social experience rather than a separate task. he started building prototypes with a small team, experimenting with different approaches to social media sharing. The early products were widgets and applications that ran on social networking platforms, letting users add functionality to their profiles and share content with friends. One early product was FunWall, a widget that let users post messages and photos to each other's profiles. Another was SuperPoke, which let users send virtual gestures to friends. These products caught on quickly, spreading virally through social networks. FunWall was installed by millions of users. SuperPoke became one of the most popular applications on Facebook when Facebook opened its platform to third-party developers in 2007. Slide was growing rapidly, becoming one of the largest social applications companies in the world. But the growth came with challenges that were different from what Max had faced at PayPal. PayPal's challenges had been primarily technical: solve fraud detection, build scalable infrastructure, integrate with financial systems. Slide's challenges were more about understanding consumer behavior, creating engaging experiences, and dealing with platform risk. Platform risk was particularly thorny. Slide's products ran on platforms like Facebook and MySpace that Slide didn't control. These platforms could change their rules, restrict features, or promote competing products at any time. Slide was building a business on someone else's foundation, and that foundation could shift without warning. This was fundamentally different from PayPal, which had built its own platform and controlled its own destiny. Max also discovered that consumer products were less predictable than infrastructure products. At PayPal, if you built a better fraud detection system or made payments faster, users appreciated it and used the service more. Success was about technical excellence and execution. At Slide, success depended more on capturing cultural moments, on understanding what experiences users wanted before they knew they wanted them, on design and viral mechanics as much as technology. Some of Slide's products succeeded wildly. Others flopped despite similar investments of time and resources. The difference often wasn't obvious. One application would go viral and gain millions of users. Another that seemed similar would go nowhere. This unpredictability was frustrating for someone like Max, who was used to systematic approaches where effort and excellence produced predictable results. Slide also faced intense competition. Zynga, founded by Mark Pincus, was building similar social gaming applications and doing so with more aggressive viral growth tactics and monetization strategies. Other companies like Rockq and SGN were competing for the same users and attention. The social application space became crowded and competitive, with companies fighting for users and trying to capture platform attention. Despite these challenges, Slide grew to become one of the largest social applications companies. At its peak, Slide's applications were being used by hundreds of millions of people around the world. The company raised substantial venture capital, reaching valuations in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Max built a large team, with offices in San Francisco and internationally. Slide looked like a major success. But underneath the surface, problems were growing. The business model was challenging. Most of Slide's applications were free, making money through advertising or virtual goods sales. But advertising rates for social applications were low. Virtual goods worked for some applications but not others. The revenue per user was small, and maintaining and growing the applications required ongoing investment. Profitability was elusive. More fundamentally, the social application space was maturing. The explosive growth of the early days was slowing. Users were getting tired of application spam and virtual gestures. The platforms were tightening restrictions on viral growth tactics. The easy opportunities had been exploited. Continuing to grow required either finding new platforms or new types of applications, both difficult in an increasingly competitive market. In 2010, Google approached Slide about an acquisition. Google was trying to build its own social networking capabilities to compete with Facebook. Google Plus was in development, and Google saw value in acquiring Slide's team and technology to accelerate its social strategy. After negotiations, Google agreed to buy Slide for approximately $182 million. For Max and Slide's investors, the acquisition was a successful outcome. They had built a company from nothing to a $182 million exit in about 6 years. But the acquisition wasn't an unqualified triumph. Slide's valuation had been higher during its peak fundraising rounds. The company never achieved the scale or impact that Max had hoped for. And the Google integration would prove disappointing. Max joined Google as part of the acquisition, but the integration didn't go well. Google's culture and processes were very different from what Max was used to at startups. Decisions that could be made in days at Slide took months at Google. Projects required approvals from multiple teams and executives. The urgency and focus that Max valued were diluted in Google's massive organization. After about a year, Google decided to shut down most of Slide's products, focusing resources on Google+ instead. Max left Google in 2011. The Slide experience taught Max important lessons. He learned that not all problems are equally tractable through technical excellence. Consumer products require different skills than infrastructure products. Building on platforms creates risks that can't be fully mitigated. Growth that depends on platform virality is fragile and can disappear when platforms change their rules. And most importantly, he learned to be more selective about the problems he chose to work on. After leaving Google, Max took time to think carefully about what to do next. He was now in his mid-30s, had been through multiple startup cycles, and had both successes and disappointments to learn from. He wanted his next venture to be something that combined his technical strengths with a problem that really mattered, something that would have lasting impact rather than just capturing a cultural moment. He started thinking about consumer finance. The financial crisis of 2008 had revealed deep problems in how credit worked in America. Millions of people had taken on mortgages and credit card debt they couldn't afford. The financial system had encouraged this through predatory lending and poorly designed incentive structures. When the bubble burst, ordinary people suffered while the financial institutions that caused the crisis were bailed out. Max saw an opportunity to build something better. The specific problem that interested Max was point-of-sale financing, helping people afford purchases by spreading payments over time. The existing options were unsatisfying. Credit cards charged high interest rates and had confusing terms. Store credit programs were often predatory, with hidden fees and deceptive pricing. Many people couldn't get approved for credit at all because they had thin credit files or had made mistakes in the past. The system didn't work well for anyone except the credit card companies and banks. Max believed technology could solve this problem. What if you could offer consumers transparent, fair financing at the moment they were making a purchase? What if you could use modern data and machine learning to assess credit risk more accurately than traditional credit scores? What if you could build a system that worked for both merchants and consumers, improving conversion for merchants while giving consumers better options than credit cards? This became the vision for Affirm, the company Max founded in 2012. Affirm would let consumers pay for purchases over time with clear, simple terms. No hidden fees. No compound interest. No surprises. The monthly payment and total cost would be shown upfront before the purchase. If consumers agreed to the terms, Affirm would pay the merchant immediately and collect payments from the consumer over time. Building Affirm required solving hard technical problems that played to Max's strengths. The core challenge was credit underwriting, deciding in real time whether to approve a purchase, how much credit to extend, and what terms to offer. This decision had to be made in seconds while the consumer was checking out. It had to be accurate enough that Affirm didn't lose money on defaults. And it had to be fair, not discriminating against people based on factors that weren't predictive of repayment. Max built systems that used machine learning to assess credit risk based on thousands of data points. Unlike traditional credit scores that primarily looked at payment history and debt levels, Affirm's models incorporated many other factors. How did the consumer interact with the application form? What were they buying? From which merchant? At what time of day? What was their income relative to the loan amount? The models learned from millions of past transactions, continuously improving their ability to predict who would repay and who wouldn't. This was similar to the fraud detection work Max had done at PayPal, but with a different objective. At PayPal, the goal was to identify fraudulent transactions and block them. At Affirm, the goal was to identify creditworthy consumers and approve them at terms that balance risk and profit. The techniques were similar: machine learning, real-time processing, continuous iteration. But the application was different, and the social impact was potentially larger. Affirm also required building partnerships with merchants who would offer Affirm as a payment option. This was hard for a startup with no track record. Merchants were conservative about payment options, reluctant to confuse customers with too many choices at checkout. Max had to convince them that Affirm would increase sales by helping consumers afford larger purchases. He had to prove that Affirm's underwriting worked, that default rates would be manageable, that the operational complexity would be worth it. Early traction came from categories where financing was particularly valuable: furniture, electronics, travel, expensive consumer goods. Merchants in these categories understood that many consumers wanted to spread payment over time. Affirm's clear, simple terms were appealing compared to traditional credit card fine print. And the approval rates were good, higher than credit cards in many cases, because Affirm's models were better at identifying creditworthy consumers that traditional credit scores missed. As Affirm grew, Max faced challenges around regulation, capital, and competition. Lending is heavily regulated, requiring licenses and compliance with numerous federal and state laws. Consumer protection rules around disclosure, fair lending, and collections had to be followed. This regulatory complexity was similar to what PayPal had faced, but in a different domain. Capital was also challenging. Unlike software companies that could scale with minimal additional investment, lending required capital to fund loans. Each dollar lent to a consumer was a dollar that couldn't be lent to someone else until it was repaid. Affirm had to raise debt capital from banks and investment funds, negotiate credit lines and securitizations, manage complex financial structures. This was different from Max's previous experiences and required building new capabilities. Competition came from multiple directions. Traditional banks and credit card companies saw buy now pay later as a threat to credit card volumes. Fintech startups like Klarna, Afterpay, and Sezzle were building similar services. Payment companies like PayPal were adding financing capabilities. The market was getting crowded, and Affirm had to differentiate itself through better underwriting, clearer terms, or superior merchant relationships. Despite these challenges, Affirm grew steadily. The company added partnerships with major retailers. It expanded internationally. It broadened its product line beyond simple installment loans to include longer-term financing for larger purchases. By 2020, Affirm was processing billions of dollars in transactions annually and preparing for an initial public offering. The IPO in January 2021 valued Affirm at nearly $12 billion. Max's stake was worth over $1 billion. The small, sickly immigrant kid from Kiev was now a billionaire. More importantly, Affirm was having real impact. The company was helping millions of people afford purchases they needed, with terms that were clearer and fairer than traditional credit. It was proving that technology could make consumer finance work better for ordinary people, not just for banks and financial institutions. Looking back across Max Levchin's career, from his childhood in Soviet Ukraine to his role as CEO of a public fintech company, several patterns emerge. Max consistently sought out hard technical problems that mattered commercially. He built world-class teams by creating cultures where technical excellence was valued above all else. He used his deep expertise in machine learning and data analysis to solve problems that others approached less systematically. And he persevered through crises and setbacks that would have caused many people to give up. The secret sources of Max's success remained consistent across different companies and contexts. His informational advantage came from deeper technical expertise than most entrepreneurs, combined with understanding of business and market dynamics that most engineers lacked. His relationship advantage came from the network of talented people he built relationships with over decades, many of whom worked with him on multiple ventures. His process advantage came from his systematic, data-driven approach to solving problems, always building systems that could learn and improve rather than static solutions. His cultural advantage came from his ability to attract and retain exceptional engineers by creating environments where hard problems were celebrated and excellence was rewarded. These advantages compounded over time. Success at PayPal gave Max credibility and resources that made Slide possible. Slide, despite its mixed outcomes, taught lessons that informed Affirm. Affirm benefited from Max's reputation, network, and accumulated wisdom from 2 decades of building companies. Each experience built on the previous ones, creating a trajectory that would have been impossible without the full journey. Max's impact on the technology industry and financial services has been substantial. At PayPal, he helped create the infrastructure that enabled modern e-commerce. Without reliable online payment processing, companies like eBay, Amazon, and thousands of other online retailers couldn't have grown the way they did. The fraud detection techniques he pioneered became industry standards, protecting billions of dollars in transactions. At Affirm, Max is helping reshape consumer lending. The buy now pay later category that Affirm helped create is changing how people think about financing purchases. The transparency and simplicity that Affirm emphasizes are pushing traditional lenders to improve their own practices. The technology Max has built is making credit accessible to people who traditional credit scores excluded. This has real impact on people's lives, helping them afford things they need without falling into debt traps. Beyond his direct business impact, Max has influenced the broader technology ecosystem through his role in the PayPal mafia. The network of PayPal alumni who went on to found or lead major companies like YouTube, LinkedIn, Yelp, Tesla, SpaceX, and others represents one of the most successful entrepreneurial networks in history. Max was a central figure in that network, both as a co-founder of PayPal and as someone who maintained relationships with other alumni and supported their subsequent ventures. Max has also been an active investor and advisor, supporting other entrepreneurs working on hard technical problems. He has invested in companies working on areas like space exploration, biotechnology, and artificial intelligence. His investments reflect his values, preference for companies tackling hard problems over easy ones, for technical depth over slick marketing, for long-term value creation over short-term hype. The contemporary relevance of Max's story is significant. In an era where much of technology entrepreneurship focuses on consumer apps and social media, Max represents a different approach, using technology to solve fundamental problems in areas like payments and lending. In a time when income inequality and financial exclusion are major social issues, Max's work on making credit more accessible and fair addresses real needs. In an industry often criticized for prioritizing growth over responsibility, Max's emphasis on technical excellence and solving real problems offers an alternative model. Max's story also illustrates broader themes about immigration and the American dream. He arrived in America as a refugee, speaking no English, from a country that no longer exists. Through education, hard work, and seizing opportunities, he became one of the most successful technology entrepreneurs of his generation. His story validates the potential of immigration to enrich America, bringing talented people who contribute far more than they take. Yet Max's story is also a reminder that success requires more than just opportunity. It requires exceptional ability, relentless drive, willingness to tackle hard problems, and perseverance through repeated failures and setbacks. Not every immigrant or entrepreneur will achieve what Max achieved. But the existence of such opportunities, the possibility that someone from anywhere can build something significant if they have the ability and determination, remains one of America's great strengths. The lessons from Max Levchin's life and career are numerous and actionable for aspiring entrepreneurs and engineers. First, technical depth creates competitive advantages that are difficult to replicate. In fields being revolutionized by technology, deep technical expertise often matters more than business experience or domain knowledge. Max succeeded in payments and lending not because he understood those industries but because he could solve technical problems that others couldn't. Second, hard problems can be better opportunities than easy ones. Most entrepreneurs look for problems they can solve quickly and easily. Max looked for problems that seemed impossible and that would create strong defensive moats if solved. This required more work and more risk, but it also created more value and more durable competitive advantages. Third, building the right team and culture is as important as having the right idea. Max's ability to attract and retain exceptional engineers was central to all his successes. He did this not through high salaries or fancy perks but by creating environments where talented people could work on hard problems with other talented people. The culture was intense and demanding but also rewarding for those who thrived in such environments. Fourth, timing matters enormously. Max succeeded at PayPal partly because he attacked online payments at exactly the right moment, early enough that incumbents hadn't yet adapted, late enough that the infrastructure existed to build on. He struggled more at Slide partly because he entered social applications just as that market was becoming saturated. At Affirm, he waited years after leaving Google to ensure he was entering at the right time with the right approach. Fifth, persistence through crisis is essential. Every company Max built faced existential threats, fraud crises at PayPal, platform risk at Slide, regulatory challenges at Affirm. Lesser founders might have given up or sold early. Max persevered, working through the problems systematically. This persistence was enabled by both deep belief in the mission and systematic problem-solving abilities that gave him confidence he could find solutions. Sixth, learn from both successes and failures. Max's willingness to honestly assess what went wrong at Slide and incorporate those lessons into Affirm was crucial. Many entrepreneurs make the same mistakes repeatedly because they don't deeply analyze their failures. Max treated failures as learning opportunities, extracting lessons, and adjusting his approach accordingly. Seventh, values and mission matter. Max could have pursued many different opportunities after PayPal. He chose to work on problems that he believed mattered, helping people share experiences online, making credit more accessible and fair. These weren't just business decisions. They reflected his values and what he wanted his legacy to be. This sense of purpose helped sustain him through difficult periods when purely financial motivations might not have been enough. Max Levchin's story is still being written. At 48 years old, he remains active as Affirm's CEO, continuing to build and refine the company's products. He is still investing in and advising other companies. He is still working on hard technical problems, still pushing himself and his teams to achieve more. The final assessment of his career and legacy is decades away. But even now, certain conclusions seem justified. Max Levchin has been one of the most important technology entrepreneurs of the past 25 years. He helped create the infrastructure that enabled the internet economy. He pioneered techniques in fraud detection and machine learning that became industry standards. He built multiple companies that created billions of dollars in value. He influenced a generation of entrepreneurs through his example and through the PayPal Mafia network. And he did it all while maintaining technical excellence and focusing on solving real problems. His story offers inspiration but also honest complexity. Success required not just hard work but also exceptional ability, fortunate timing, valuable relationships, and some luck. The path included failures and disappointments, not just triumphs. The personal costs, in terms of stress and sacrifices, were significant. Success in entrepreneurship is neither easy nor guaranteed, even for someone with Max's abilities. Yet the core message remains powerful. A small, sickly kid from Soviet Ukraine, armed with mathematical talent and relentless determination, could come to America and help shape the future of technology and finance. He could solve problems that others said were impossible. He could build systems that processed billions of dollars and served millions of people. He could achieve wealth and influence while staying true to his values of technical excellence and solving meaningful problems. This is the story of Max Levchin. It is a story about the power of education, perseverance, technical depth, systematic problem solving, and seizing opportunities. It is a story about how hard problems can become competitive advantages. It is a story about immigration and the American capacity to transform talented individuals from anywhere into builders of the future. And it is a story, ultimately, about what one determined individual can accomplish when they combine exceptional ability with focused effort applied to problems that truly matter.